started. So I will give a brief introduction about our seminar and the logistics and also about Dr. John Adler. So first, thanks everyone for joining Stanford Physics seminar today. While we are waiting for more people to join, I just want to give a brief introduction about the Stanford Medical Physics Seminar Series. So it is a virtual educational platform supported by Stanford Radiation Oncology Department. It is dedicated to the research and clinicians for exchanging their research and clinical experience while educating our young generation medical physicists and radiation oncologists. So all the talks given in this seminar series are recorded, so you can always visit our website. I think Matt is already put in the chat, so you can go back to our website to listen. Meanwhile, the upcoming talks will be announced on the website as well. By the way, if you are interested in speaking in our seminar, feel free to submit your request on the website as well. So as it is virtual, so some logistics need to be clarified. So please turn off your microphone and the video during the speaker's presentation. We will have a dedicated Q&A sections after the presentation. If you have questions, please raise your hand or type in chat. Questions will be selected to answer after the presentation. So coming down to our today's seminar, today we are honored to have Dr. John Adler join us to give us a talk. I believe almost everyone here, especially those working in the SIS field, know Dr. Adler. I feel my words might not be sufficient and bright enough to describe Dr. Adler's achievement. Instead, I recommend you to check out the Wikipedia, which has a very good description of Dr. Adler's life and achievement. Matt is also put that link in the chat. For introduction here, I only would like to make it simple. So Dr. Adler is a Emeritus Professor of Stanford University, a neurosurgeon, an inventor, and entrepreneur. Today, he is going to share with us his experience and insight of radiosurgery. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Adler to this virtual stage. Dr. Adler, podium is yours now.
Thank you, Shujin. And I'd like to thank the Department of Physics for inviting me to give this talk. I have given portions of this talk in the past to some of the physics group and the radiation oncology team. And so a few of this, part of this may be recognizable, but hopefully there's a lot of new information that you will find useful. And so I've given this talk now for the last several months. And I think it's a useful perspective, both for me to look backwards and also for many of you who are new to the field of radiosurgery to understand the change in this field over one man's lifetime. Of course, I was only part of the story, but I certainly am testament to things that have changed in that time. And so I start by giving a shout out to Stanford, my home. I actually live on campus, but I'm sure my life would have never happened in any other university in the world. And very fortunate to have landed at Stanford 35 years ago when I first moved here. So speaking of the past, my introduction to radiosurgery started when I was a last year resident at Stanford. I'm at Harvard, Stanford, when I did a fellowship at the Karolinska Institute, prior to which I had really no understanding of what really radiosurgery was, or much less the gamma knife specifically. And I went to the Karolinska Institute expecting to do a cerebral vascular fellowship, but literally in a couple of weeks, I was introduced to the gamma knife, met Professor Lars Lexell, and my life was forever changed. And yes, that's me with hair on my head. I wish it was still true. So Lars Lexell, from my perspective, and many neurosurgeons, is deemed one of the great minds of the neurosurgical minds of the 20th century. And the genius what he encapsulated in the idea of radiosurgery, a term he invented, is hard to deny. And in fact, not only is it genius, it's so simple. And it's the simplicity, I think, that has given it such enduring value. And to reduce radiosurgery to its essence, it's about accurate localization inside the human body, and then maximally cross-fired beams of radiation through the target of interest. Now, for physicists, especially physicists growing up in the modern era, this may seem self-evident, but it was not so self-evident a long time ago, much less its applications were not self-evident. And in fact, even many of the applications, I think, ended up being far beyond anything Lexell dreamed about. But of note, Lexell's earliest life was about stereotactic localization. So he, right off the bat, checked that first box. He understood how to target in the human brain. But then combining that localization understanding with radiation was really what made radiosurgery a reality. And it started very much with the Gamma knife, although he did play with other things. He tried with orthovoltage X-ray sources. He was interested in ultrasound. Obviously, ultrasound doesn't work in the head, didn't work until you had next generation products, but clearly a man before his time. Well, I took my time with Lars Lexell, and it changed my life. And I was fortunate enough to land at Stanford. And at Stanford, I became interested in image-guided tracking, both in the operating room, but more globally in the radiation world. And working with the engineering group at what's today the AI group and robotics group, we developed a X-ray image guidance system that uses X-ray image-to-image correlation. And of course, that's the bedrock principle by which we were able to eventually make a cyberknife. And that man on the left, who was not so happy with the stereotactic frame, was one of the patients we were treating at Stanford prior to the arrival of the cyberknife. And one day I asked him, I said, tell me what you think of your stereotactic frame. And he gave me the finger. And in fact, this was a perfect encapsulation of what the first generation of radiosurgery was with stereotactic frames. Well, using the work that we did at Stanford in the robotics and AI team, we then went on to make that cyberknife. And here you see the very first patient being treated in 1994. And while you see me standing in the middle, to the left, that's Dr. Hoppe. And the back, there were some other members of the physics team. I have to give a big shout out to Stanford Physics. This project would never have worked anywhere else in the world, especially without Stanford Physics. At the time, there was a guy named Rick Cox, who was a great rock star, and Peter Fessenden. And the cyberknife evolved over the years, and there you see me continue to treat my first patient there in the upper left image. Today, you have about 450 cyberknives around the world, and yeah, it looks a lot more modern and sleek. It did some amazing things. There was a Stanford patient that you see there whom we treated spinal cord AVM on. He had been quadriparetic only a few months before we treated him. And there you see, eventually the AVM totally disappeared. He went on to become a very successful pianist. And not only that, he could see he was living a vigorous life, hiking in the Sierra Nevadas. But that kind of a treatment was not a reality until the cyberknife emerged, technology very much enabled by being at Stanford. Not only that, the cyberknife went on to do some relatively cool things. The man on the left you see is now retired neurosurgeon, but he was the first patient whose prostate cancer was treated with the cyberknife along with Chris King. But I personally was very instrumental in getting the fiducials into his prostate. He was a friend of mine, and he wouldn't have anything other treatment for his early stage prostate. He wanted the cyberknife for nothing. And of course, now we treat more than 100,000 patients around the world with this hypofractionated approach, if not several 100,000. So radiosurgery has certainly emerged as a bedrock tool throughout the whole body, very much beginning with the cyberknife. And early days, I was very involved in treating the first pancreas cancer, lung cancer patients that treated. Actually, the first few pancreas cancer patients were very much treated by me because under the supervision of Joe Poen and David Tate. But it was an adventurous time and not a heavily regulated time. And of course, I was very proud of the fact that Stanford eventually treated the first cardiac ablation case. And I think that this is an avenue of treatment for cardiac disease that may be enormous going forward, and really one of the biggest areas of therapeutic radiation. Again, thanks to image-guided targeting and precision radiation like the CyberKnife. Well, the CyberKnife achieved a lot, and it went on, I think, to have a big influence throughout the entire field of therapeutic radiation. Today, there isn't a technology that doesn't offer some form of image guidance, whether it's cone beam CT or now, you have ViewRay and all kinds of integrated imaging technologies. We view imaging coupled to therapeutic radiation delivery as one and the same. And there you see even the Gamma Knife eventually used their incorporated cone beam CT into their ICON technology. Well, unknown to many, even many neurosurgeons who do radiosurgery has crept up from being an afterthought in the treatment of brain tumor to today the most common way neurosurgeons treat brain tumor. So you can fake a lot of data in this world, but it's hard to fake Medicare data, and this is Medicare data. And you can see how 30 years ago, radiosurgery was just getting started, just a few cases were done. But today, for every open operation neurosurgeons do for brain tumor, they're doing 1.5 radiosurgery cases. And yet I'm going to try to impress upon you, we're not doing enough radiosurgery yet. Of course, neurosurgeons don't do all the radiosurgery, but there's certainly a benchmark of what is going on in the world today. As we look at radiosurgery and kind of position it against other treatments in medicine, modern treatments, I'm a firm believer that radiosurgery is one of the most transformative ideas in all of healthcare today. I believe that radiosurgery is every bit the equal of things that get talked about so often, like genetics, proteomics, mRNA vaccines for COVID, CRISPR, immunotherapies, which are transformational, CAR T cells, TAVR, aortic valve replacement, which my dad just had a week ago. These are modern marvels. But I would submit that the idea that non-invasively you can remove a tumor without anesthesia and with incredible efficacy and relatively low cost is one of the greatest accomplishments of healthcare. And when we look around the world today, we think there are approximately 200,000 patients with brain and head and neck tumors that would be potential candidates for radiosurgery that get this treatment today. So about 200,000 patients are getting it. But when we do a bottoms-up analysis in the addressable middle income and wealthy regions of the world, we think that there is between 2 and 5 million potential patients by the end of this decade. So this is the field I've given my life to pretty much. And I look at how underpenetrated, how underutilized this miracle of medicine is. We are literally treating less than 10% of the patients in the world. And to me, that is a big divide. And once I had that understanding, this came to me about 12, 13, 14 years ago when I was back at Stanford. I really dedicated my life to seeing if we could make it much more available so that millions of patients would have radiosurgery today. The lack of availability of radiosurgery in the world is not a secret. I'm not the only one to recognize this. There's a couple articles that showed around the world, whether you measure by gamma knives or linear accelerator type technologies, there's a deficiency of facilities and therefore a shortage of patients being treated. The gamma knife and the linear accelerators have many things different, but also some things in common. And what I want to impress upon you is the cost and complexity of existing radiosurgical platforms. Now, in the radiation oncology, radiation physics world, you take for granted, well, these machines are expensive, the procedure is expensive, the facilities are expensive. But if you benchmark what we do in radiation delivery against everything else in medicine, it's quick to understand that radiosurgery is the most expensive procedure in healthcare today. Now, there's a proton story and there's even a carbon story, but all these are extreme outliers when compared to what goes on for the rest of medicine today. Whether you go into the operating room, get treated with the Da Vinci robot, or you get some other complex technology, nothing is as complex and expensive as therapeutic radiation. Now, some of that's good for physicists because you guys, complex world needs more physicists. But perhaps it also has limited the availability of this procedure for millions of patients around the world. And that's what we believe, and that was dedicated my life to overcoming. And these costs come in different forms. These costs can be upfront money, multi-million-dollar machines, but also multi-million-dollar vaults. And some vaults can be more than $10, $15 million in many locations, including at Stanford. And moreover, it's the complexity. Most of these machines, whether the complexity comes from having to deal with cobalt regulation or from managing very complex machines that can treat everything from your prostate to your brain to your breast to your lung, that complexity creates a barrier to the wider dissemination of these technologies. So about 12 years ago, back at Stanford, I was trying to say, well, maybe we could think about making this simpler and more available. Maybe we could make a technology that's more available to the rest of the world. And so I started just thinking with some friends, some physicists in the Department of Physics at Stanford, elsewhere, and some people eventually at Varian. And we kind of came up with some high-level specs that would make a machine that could be more readily installed in more locations and be lower cost. And so I started with literally a clean sheet of paper, how to make a next generation radiosurgical technology for treat just brain and head and neck tumors. The idea being to optimize it for brain and head and neck. Not just make something that's I like to liken to a Swiss Army knife that could do anything, but not necessarily optimized for any application, but make something best in class for brain and head and neck. And we used a very comprehensive design process, especially once we moved to Varian. We had, the design firm Lunar Design. We started with a clean sheet of paper and lots of Post-its and lots of brainstorming and drag things off my shelf. Here was a tennis ball for a while, seemed like a good idea, didn't pan out. Over the span of kind of half a year, we went through literally more than 100 different permutations, different designs. And just tried to be, nothing was off table. Would we have like 20 linear accelerators in this machine, 20 low-cost linear accelerator machines? Would we have was it a half MV? Was it 4 MV or 6 MV? And what was the weight? What was the design? But what we wanted to make sure that at the end it was self-shielded and best in class. We went through these different concepts, and we did some design reviews and mathematical analysis, and we one by one we threw out one after the next, and then we did even more sophisticated analysis. Solid angle is very important in the quality of the treatment that you deliver. I mean, solid angle is directly proportional, actually more than directly proportional to the third power. It communicates your ability to develop a steep dose gradient. So we've emphasized very much dose gradient. That was what we think how you measure quality of treatment. And then we actually here back at Stanford, we made various different physical models. Here we are concerned that we might be developing something claustrophobic, and we had different ideas for shielding scatter radiation off the patient. And we eventually came up with this incredibly cool looking device. And it was just, I was in love with this. This seemed, after the design process, to be cooler than anything I could imagine and really worthy of the 21st century. But then we stuck a phantom inside the beam of a 3 MV Linac and realized that this was going to just scatter radiation everywhere and that this device would never be adequately shielded. So with this kind of point of discouragement, I came to realize that sitting on my desk the entire time for the 3 years that we had worked on this was this kind of gimbal within a gimbal construct. I liken to a gyroscope. And it was with that understanding and some smart mechanical engineers I was working with, we took a very different approach. And we've created this kind of what we refer to as a gyroscopic surgical robot optimized for brain and head and neck radiosurgery. So by using a gimbal-like or this gyroscopic approach, we could crossfire the beam from more directions and deliver what we believe would be best-in-class radiosurgery. So the mechanical elements here are novel, and those of you who've never seen it, most of you have probably never seen a ZapX, but there you see, we have the standard axial gantry that you're all familiar with in your variant TrueBeam, for example, but we have this secondary gimbal nested within it. We refer to as an oblique gantry. And these two move independent of each other, and in doing so, allow your linear accelerator to shoot from more directions. Now, the structural elements that move the critical components in space is a spherical structure, although cut in half with bearings. And this device contains the radiation within the machine, combined with what we refer to as a rotary shell and this vertical door. But I'm going to impress upon you this, while it seems claustrophobic, it is not. And so then it's a robot with a total of 6 degrees of freedom. The table has 3 degrees of freedom, moving with 50 micron accuracy, and is responsible for positioning the target at the center of the axis of rotation, or the virtual isocenter between the oblique and the axial gantries. And then we have the tracking. It's CyberKnife-like, except there's a single imager that moves around the patient with a KV source and a KV amorphous silica detector. And by comparing these projections, in time, we can correlate, like we do with the CyberKnife, and establish patient head position orientation, feed that back into the table, and make small movements of the table to keep the target on isocenter. The linear accelerator, as you'll see, is a 3MV Linac and has a very unique collimation system, which uses in the end a pencil beam of radiation, but the quality of the collimation is unparalleled and gives us really a pristine beam to work with. And then lastly, we have a first of its kind of real-time dose monitoring system that both assures that we're delivering the dose we think we are, and in time we think will even give us spatial confirmation that we're approximately hitting the target we think we are. So what you're going to see here is this video, which is going to show you how this all comes together. And it is very dramatic looking, and you see how the operator sits right next to the machine itself. The machine is closed, but it is not claustrophobic. It opens up inside, so it's much more open than an MR or even a CT scan. There's a couple of windows that actually look in and out of the machine, which helps with the claustrophobia. The patient's head is immobilized in an aquaplast mass. Said again, the machine closes around the patient, much like you close a vault door, but it is not claustrophobic. Here's the collimation, 800 pounds of tungsten that blocks almost all primary scatter off the target. And you have a 45 centimeter SAD. Inside the beam path, you have this circular disc that allows you to change aperture sizes from 4 millimeters to 2.5 centimeters, literally in a second. We have a new beam aperture even going down to 3 millimeters. So you'll see the tracking works like CyberKnife, using X-ray image-to-image correlation from different projection angles. And we use DRRs to correlate the live images against, and that correlation process establishes position orientation. The machine moves with high precision. Here's the table showing you that 50 micron precision, positioning the target at isocenter. And then you'll see how the rotational degrees of freedom interact with one another. Here you see the axial rotation, like your TrueBeam, and now you have an oblique rotation, which you don't have in TrueBeam. And this maybe you would with a couch kick, for example. But the two work independently of each other, and you'll see how this gives you more solid angle crossfire. And we're not done. You will see, even while we can get 2 pi stereo most of the head today, you're going to see even more in the future, as we seek to move the head during the procedure by flexing the neck. So today the machine is a point and shoot. It's like CyberKnife. You go to a position in space, you image, you track, you deliver a beam. But you can see how naturally that feeds into a arc-based procedure. which is what we're working on already today. So in the next couple of years, you should look to see ARCs in this procedure will make it even faster. So these are real-time dosimeter. This is what allows us to confirm the dose as determined by the dosimeters in the head. Assuming the machine is properly calibrated, you never have a problem. But if the machine is not properly calibrated, you do. And this forever eliminates that risk. And so here you see have some next generation facilities. I want you to notice that there's no cement vault and they're highly, highly visible. The goal is, in many of our customers, is to build their brand around this visible technology. And so there you see some of our facilities, quite dramatic looking. The one in the bottom is actually in a bullet train station in the outskirts of Tokyo. The idea is to make radiosurgery very visible to the world. While we're building the brand, we're also making patients aware of this miracle of modern medicine. This miracle that you do almost every day, what's bottled up inside dark basements that the world never gets to see. So, importantly, no radioactive cobalt. So while we replicate a lot of the capabilities of the Gamma Knife, none of the need to worry about cobalt-60. And moreover, the performance is quite good at 1500 rad per minute isocenter. The mechanical elements, as I already alluded to, are unlike any other LINAC device with these 2 degrees of freedom. This gives you more crossfire from more directions, gives you ultimately a steeper dose gradient. And as I'll show you, and this all comes from the constellation of attributes that we have. It's beam energy, it's crossfire, it's the collimation, and lastly, the system SAD. So when you stitch that all together, you can see how compared to CyberKnife, the blue is the Gamma Knife, the blue curve, and the green is the ZapX. This comes from B&I, physicist there, Steve Solvenson. You can see how the ZapX has the steepest dose gradient. And importantly, this is first generation. It's going to get better in time as we open up the solid angle further. So this is why starting with a clean sheet of paper is important, because you can optimize just for this application. Again, we have the capacity to keep improving, and which is not true of these other technologies. Moreover, when you put this into actual treatment cases, this work comes from the NHS and a guy named Ian Paddock, a physicist there, who was commissioned by the NHS to look at the quality of different radiosurgical platforms. And he found on average that he was plotting the R 50% over different tumor volumes. And the perfection would be just 1, a straight line at 1. But what we found was that the Gamma Knife, those green triangles, had the best theoretical curve, and when you try to actually treat patients. And then the CyberKnife had some of these blue diamonds, and then there was a scatter plot of different sort of LINAC machines, and then tomotherapy was really grossly inadequate. And in fact, at the end of the study, it was determined that tomotherapy should not be doing radiosurgery. But then they plotted these same cases with the ZapX treatment planning system, and we were among the best of the best, even better than the Gamma Knife. And again, we have yet to optimize the platform, both in terms of its beam crossfire delivery and the treatment planning module that we have today. So already best in class with improvement to come, whether these were metastasis or meningiomas, benign brain tumors. So here's just some representative cases that have been treated over the last 3 years since we've been starting to treat patients. Started to treat the end of 2019. There you see a trigeminal neuralgia, which we do particularly well because of this steep dose gradient, and both fast and very little dose going to the brainstem. Here's some multiple METS cases, again, very fast, but I think you're going to find this even faster once we move to ARCs. Once we move to ARCs, it's easy to envision a world where you can treat individual brain METs in just a couple minutes and do best-in-class treatments without having to do a VMAT-like smearing of radiation over the brain. So this will allow one to do best-in-class radiosurgery for patients who can get multiple lesions over multiple years. That's why I continue to think if you can do isocentric treatments for brain mets, it's important, because if and when they come back, you can treat without fear of delivering a deleterious integral dose. So there's only a handful of clinical papers reporting outcomes. But to date, we're getting clinical outcomes that are representative of other technologies. It's my hope in time that as we treat ever more challenging cases, we're going to able to show that we have some superiority. But from right out of the gate, we're comparable. And here's kind of a representative case of a skull base trigeminal schwannoma. And as you can see, the patient who was treated to 15 gray got loss of central contrast enhancement and tumor shrinkage over the less than year follow-up that this patient had. But we're starting to get patients with more than 2-year follow-up, and you'll be seeing more and more clinical papers in time. So this technology is now available, started treating patients in 2019 in the United States. We now have clearance in much of the world, and we're hoping to get regulatory clearance here in China here just in the next couple of months here. So we're getting very, very close to the finish line, albeit after a 5-6 year, very difficult course, especially with COVID. So there's now 13 machines installed around the world. There's another 30 plus that have been sold in various different regions of the world. And the map here shows you that distributed much of the world, but Europe has been particularly strong for us, especially France, especially many of the big cancer centers in France. But we are an emerging technology that we think is going to help redefine how brain and head and neck radiation is done. So the company, I invite all of you to come visit me sometime. I think Lei Xing's been here, but we've been around for 8 years now. We're headquartered down in San Carlos, and we're spin out of Varian. But this project proved a little too innovative and therefore scary for Varian, which is why we spun it out. But Foxconn, the company that makes the consumer electronics for Apple and much of the world, is a primary investor of ours, and hopefully going to help us do great things in China, where we think there's a great market. In summary, the ZapX is a new generation, next generation radiosurgical platform that, number one, gets rid of your radiotherapy vault, allows you to put this radiosurgery much more readily where patients are. You don't necessarily always have to be in the basement of big hospitals, and you can go into neuroscience centers and ambulatory surgery centers and really make radiosurgery more available in the world. And that's how we're going to treat more patients, the patients who should be getting treated today but are not. Of course, there's no radioactive cobalt. You don't need to worry about that. And I do think the world is trying to get rid of radioactive cobalt. A few countries in Europe have already made that decision. And that, of course, is helping our own business. But it's clear that cobalt-60 is dangerous stuff if ever in the hands of bad people. And so we're certainly eliminating that risk and the regulations around managing cobalt-60. And so in the end, we develop a best-in-class delivery system that delivers with the steepest dose gradient, minimal radiation scatter, and over time, it gives us the platform to doing better and better as we start to optimize a treatment planning system that's only first generation. As we start to expand the workspace, what we have today is already the best, but will be even better in the future. And that's going to be particularly important as we go into what I think is the next generation, a huge opportunity in brain radiation and in brain treatments. And that's going back to the very origins of radiosurgery. So when Lexell created radiosurgery on the back of his stereotactic frame, and there you see it on the left, he envisioned this being a tool for non-invasive brain lesioning to treat behavioral, or what we call functional disorders of the brain. Things like chronic pain, depression, obsessive compulsive disease. That was why he built his Gamma Knife. And you know what? I think we're going back to some of that original vision. Not all, but some. So if you step back for a second and think about what the big diseases in the world today, they're not cancer. As much as you care about cancer, as much as you've dedicated, and I've dedicated my life to treating cancer, it's ultimately one of the less important big diseases in the world today. While heart disease is a little more important, nothing is more important than the behavioral diseases that cause so many problems in the world today. Things like addiction and chronic pain and depression, obsessive compulsive disease. When the World Health Organization lists the most important diseases in the world, these are the diseases they actually care most about. Tuberculosis might be number 3 or 4 on the list or something, but cancer is like number 8. These are the big diseases in the world that we have very limited treatment options today. And if you don't think these treatment options are limited, just walk down the streets of San Francisco and you'll see patients all over the place sleeping on the street. We have done a very poor job treating these types of diseases. In fact, many of us have just thrown up our hands and say, there's nothing we can do. We just accept that these diseases exist. But I have news for you. There is good news happening. And that is that neuroscientists have increasingly started to understand the pathology that underlies these diseases. And the pathology isn't the whole brain is bad, it's brain circuits are bad. And we've teased out these specific brain circuits. Some of the best work in the world is being done at Stanford. People like Carl Diceroff and optogenetics. So no longer are these diseases of the brain, these are diseases of discrete brain circuits. And now that we understand more better these brain circuits, what you're seeing is people like mostly neurosurgeons are now implanting deep brain stimulators to inhibit these brain circuits. And by inhibiting these brain circuits, finding dramatic outcomes in diseases like depression and addiction. This is going to be one of the most important areas of medicine over the next 20 years. I think this could be the single most important area of medicine because we're starting finally have an avenue of treatment. So what you have, here's the addiction circuit on the left, and you can look at how complex that is. Look at, and so what we're realizing though is it's not enough just to treat 1 or 2 of these little nodes in the circuit, that more and more you need to treat multiple nodes in the circuit. And there's a leader in this is a guy named Eddie Chang. He's the chair of UCSF, former Pali high school student, but he's understood with machine learning that as you start studying these patients with electrical recording, that you can, in fact, in almost every patient, understand what the pathology is behind diseases like depression. And so what he's now starting to do is he's starting to not just put 1 or 2 electrodes in people's brains, but multiple electrodes. In fact, people are talking about having to put in 7 or 8, 10 electrodes to both upregulate and downregulate certain nodes of these complex circuits. While it's exciting that we now have treatments for maybe the vast majority of these patients who we can't treat today, it is hard to conceive of a world where this is practical, where for literally hundreds of millions, if not a billion patients, we're going to implant almost a half dozen or a dozen electrodes. Just not tenable. So as an aside, about 10, 12 years ago, I was intrigued when I was back at Stanford that radiation had some effects that could not be described by ablation. And the best example of that is trigeminal neuralgia, where you treat the nerve and you don't destroy it, but the pain disappears, and it sometimes disappears literally within hours. So I took that observation, referred to it as radiomodulation, and went back to treat at Stanford 12 years ago, 3 patients who had intractable depression in the setting of bipolar disease. And what I'd like you to see was that is plotted out in these curves here, what's called the Hamilton Depression Score, that 2 of the patients were virtually cured, and they got cured almost over a week. That is not explained at all by the lesional basis by which we've come to understand radiation. And of course, the dose we used here was deliberately non-lesional. A lesional dose in the brain to treat tremor and things like that is generally 130 to 150 gray, and we chose 60 gray to a very small target. Now, having said that, we found that 1 of the patients didn't have an improvement on the Hamilton Depression Score, but actually had a clinical improvement. And what we know is that almost 10 years later, these patients remain significantly improved. So this is an example of what I'd call radiomodulation, the ability to neuromodulate the brain with a non-lesional dose of radiation that occurs almost instantaneously. So I took the impression, the hunch, and that clinical vignette that maybe there is this new world of radiation that is non-lesional that can change the activity of neurons. And working with National Taiwan University, we looked at, in a miniature pig model, what happens when you irradiate very small regions of the brain. In this case, we're using a cyberknife and we're using the relatively big brain of the pig. All this is relatively crude with what we could do in a human being, but the point is that we were able to study brain activity with this experimental model, measuring brain activity with FDG PET, and then also sacrificing these animals and looking at MRI. But the take-home message was in this series of animals that we treated, we found something that was totally unexpected. We found that doses between 10 and 40 gray did not have any lesional capabilities at all. In fact, they did just the opposite. They disinhibited the brain. They disinhibited. They activated neurons. And then when we we increased the dose a little bit more from 50 to 60 gray, we did see inhibition. And then we went to even larger doses. We went up to 120 gray eventually. At that point, we started seeing at the 70, 80, 120 gray, we started seeing clear area of necrosis or lesions based first on MRI, then sacrificing these animals. And what I'm showing you is data out to 2 years. And it isn't plotted here for 2 years, but this data survived the 2-year threshold. And at that time, low dose showed no lesion, but showed increased activation. Intermediate dose showed no lesion, but decreased activation. And then we saw both decreased activation and lesion. So the point is that radiation has this complex biology with neurons, and it is not just destructive. That's the take-home message. Tried to do an analogous experiment, but this time with direct brain stimulation. Now we're doing this work in Aarhus University in Denmark and Mainz University in Germany. And what we found this time, when we embedded this 64-channel brain electrode array inside pigs that were delivered radiosurgery to very small volumes, again, relatively crude, because we're using 7.5 millimeter volume collimator. This time we're treating the visual cortex. This is an area of great study in neurobiology, and many Nobel Prizes have won in the field of looking at the visual cortex, so it's relatively well understood. So now in this small brain of the mini pig, after we did radiosurgery to various doses, we then and we waited for 6 months. We then implanted these electrode arrays. And what I'm going to show you here is what we studied, their visual evoked potentials. Again, visual evoked potentials are a classic neuroscience tool for interrogating brain activity. And what we found again, shockingly, was at doses less than 40 gray, between 20 and 40 gray, we found disinhibition. We found activation of brain circuits, localized. And then when we increased the dose further, we found inhibition. All this time documented not by PET, but by direct brain recordings. So then we distilled all this knowledge and we created this graph here, which represents both visual evoked and PET activation signals. And we look and we plot it off in this one curve. And what we're plotting here is both brain activation and inhibition. And what you'll see is you get a sigmoidal-like, drug-like effect. Again, activity above the baseline, black being the baseline, and then you get inhibition, and then you get cell injury and death as you get out to the greater doses of 70, 80 and gray and above. And all this was confirmed as having no necrosis, no brain injury at these lower doses. And this lasted up to 2 years, at which time we sacrificed these animals. It could be even more durable, if we just don't know, but that's as long as we've run these experiments. So I liken this to a non-invasive directed energy form of brain neuromodulation. Obviously, we refer to it as radiomodulation. So now we're turning to a real pathology. So in Taiwan, we now have a colony of these pigs that have been exposed to alcohol. They have to push a knob to get their alcohol. And we studied their behavior. And what we found is these alcoholic pigs, or addicted pigs, it's a form of addiction, have no interest, they lose interest in eating and water and toys and even sex. All they want to do is drink alcohol. So you'll see this pig who's had much too much to drink. He falls over intoxicated, but is not interested in playing or eating, or all he goes over the alcohol pan. And we can show how he's actually pushing his snout against these red button to get more and more alcohol all the time. And so we've started treating these pigs now in the end of December, and we are finding a dramatic decrease in their interest in alcohol. A very primitive experiment still, because their brain is small and the technology is suboptimal, but we feel that this is early evidence that we can treat alcoholism and addiction, and we are planning right now to treat our first patients, real patients, in Germany sometime this year. So this goes back now again to the importance of having an optimized platform. So the target area in a human, because we want to optimize this for human, is not going to be the crude delivery that we're now giving to the pig. It's going to be focused simply on the shell of the nucleus accumbens, a very delicate structure adjacent to the optic nerves and, of course, adjacent to other critical anatomy in the brain. And this is going to be why it's so important to get the best possible dose gradient that allows you to eventually sculpt out this shell-like structure. And so all the little attributes that came together in the ZapX that give us that steep dose gradient are going to be utilized as we go off to treat these next generation of clinical applications. And as I alluded, we now have a 3 millimeter collimator directly for this group of patients, and we're even contemplating now a 2 millimeter collimator as we think about ever more discrete small targets, including the ventral lateral hypothalamus to treat obesity someday, which is now starting to be treated by former Stanford alum who's now at UPenn, Casey Halperin, with deep brain stimulation. So if you can treat with deep brain stimulation, we think you can eventually find the same clinical benefits with radiomodulation and a tool like the ZapX. So where am I? So in the end, I did go to Varian and I helped make their Edge product, but they were forever committed to making what I would call the Swiss Army knife approach to radiotherapy and therapeutic radiation. And while it is true, if you could only have one tool, all you got was one tool, that perhaps that is the best approach. But as we start learning the importance of extreme high quality treatments, as we start appreciating just how many patients would benefit from a specialized scalpel, I believe that we're going to look at the need for more specialized tools, especially in the brain. And that's why I've gone to make the ZapX. Want to give physicians caring for these brain disorders the best possible clinical platform with which to work. And that's really why I spent the last 12 years making this next generation technology. And one of these days, I hope I even get to work with you guys. So anyway, that's my story, what it's done most recently to make a next generation radiosurgery platform. And I've really tried to take you from the earliest days of radiosurgery to where we are today. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Adler, for this wonderful talk. I already see some questions typed in the chat. So Dennis Chick, do you want to ask question by yourself, or I can make you allowed to talk? But anyway, there seems like there are 6 Daniel's Chicks there.
So somebody was concerned that how low can you go in the deck? So it's designed, I mean, the technology is designed to go to the base of the neck in a 95% American male. Go obviously achieve that more readily in other, smaller people, women included. But it's still kind of a work in progress. We've only gone to the mid portions of the neck so far, and we're still working on refining both the targeting processes and the positioning of the table. We have a whole new generation of table and head support that's going to be released here in the next 6 months, which will allow one to finally go to the lower part of the neck. So someone said that, yeah, the Zapex is very weighty. It weighs 25 tons. And at first, when I talk to radiation oncologists and radiation physicists, their first impulse is, well, let's put it in the department. Well, that's kind of the whole impetus. While we are in some radiation oncology departments, we would argue, and we've done it, and we continue to do it. The whole beauty of it is you don't need to put it in your radiation oncology department. You can put it wherever the patients are, and you don't need a vault. A recent vault at Stanford was built for 8 figures. They're expensive. You don't want to waste an expensive vault. And moreover, it's a shame that and I believe this, is that here I'm a neurosurgeon who believes more in therapeutic radiation than many times radiation oncologists and physicists, because I think the world doesn't know about modern radiation. That's why you want to make it visible. It's a shame. Again, most doctors, 90% of doctors have never seen a modern piece of therapeutic radiation equipment. And of course, patients know even less. And so you've got this miracle of medicine. It's just hidden away inside the basements, oftentimes of the second bottom floor of basements. And it's the idea here is to make it more visible. Now, for some people that doesn't work, it doesn't work. But what we're finding is when you do make it more visible, you actually find that you're a much busier clinic. And someone asked about the price. It's in the mid $2 million. But we'll make a special deal for Stanford.
Yeah, one more
Especially
question.
if you make it visible. I've actually challenged Stanford to put one in the Stanford Shopping Center. That's really where I'd love to put it. And we'd love to put one in Times Square, New York. But you'll see some very imaginative new locations for Zapexes. And it's important that the world, again, be aware of just the accomplishments of modern radiation physics and radiation oncology. Does the addiction trial include a placebo arm with patients in the ZAP, but without the beam? Eventually, yeah, absolutely will. Yeah, but we're still laying out the protocol right now. So there's a lot of work to be done here in this addiction space. So it'll be done in Germany.
Okay, Dr. Gibbs have questions. Dr. Gibbs, do you want to talk?
Yes, can you hear me?
I am hearing you. Yeah.
Hey, John, I'm not showing my camera, but thank you for this really wonderful talk. I think when I think about this new device that you've created masterfully, I also think about the broader democratization of radiation, not only to different non-oncologic disease sites, but across the world. And I'm wondering whether or not, as you're thinking about this, that you envision this being in many mid to low income countries, and does the price tag end up somehow eventually getting down to that point where this one could be utilized in that setting? Absolutely,
and that's really the founding principle for why I made this technology. The vast majority of the patients in the world aren't outside the United States. I might argue that maybe brain, head, neck radiosurgery is 50% underpenetrated in the United States, but you have places like Africa, which has maybe 50, 60, 70 linacs in the entire continent of 1 billion people. And so, places like Indonesia has one gamma knife in Jakarta for a country of 350 million people. Philippines has one gamma knife, maybe a couple linacs for a country of 100 million. So you have huge numbers of patients in this world who, in middle income countries, it's going to be very hard to kind of put it in the middle of the Congo tomorrow, but in many areas of the world, you have a burgeoning middle class and resources that, if you just didn't have an overly expensive technology, could treat lots and lots of patients. And that's one reason China's a big story for us. India is a big story for us. And I'm glad you brought that, because really this is fundamentally about the democratization of radiosurgery.
But if we think about,
however, one more side, these countries, they'll all look to the US for leadership. So you have to they look to Stanford and they say, oh, But once Stanford has done it and vetted it, then that means a lot more to them than them vetting it by themselves.
Yeah, but if you think about it mainly for cancer, then that limitation to just the neck is a little limitation except for cancer pain. And so perhaps that's a broader use for such a specialized device.
Well, these countries are big countries with, literally China probably has 1 million patients a year. And so there are huge opportunities. And we know from experience that things like a Gamma knife, which is expensive and complex in its own right, they go to some developing countries and they're very busy. The Gamma knife those are the busiest machines. The Gamma knife in Shanghai does like 1,500 patients a year. They run 2 or 3 shifts. So anyway, we're going to find out, but it's very much intended to democratize radiosurgery around the world. And I would liken the fact that, maybe the way cell phones went to the developing world very quickly, and they skipped the whole generation of landline telephony. Maybe you'll see radiosurgery instead of going to open surgery, which is expensive and complex. And, not very few things are as complex as open surgery. We think about infection control and materials and training. So perhaps radiosurgery can right out of the gate replace a lot of what open surgery is still doing here in the United States, but now doing it in developing countries. So someone raised a simple, interesting question about how much for global warming, by getting rid of concrete, we can have an impact on global warming. I guess at some finite level, that's true. It's a cute idea. I hadn't heard of it, but we're happy to get rid of, cobalt-60. It's mined in, cobalt's mined in some of the worst circumstances in the world, in pits in the Congo, and then radioactive material. It's horrible. One Gamma knife in the wrong hands of the wrong people could shut down the city, half of New York City for, the next 30 years, or Tokyo or something like that. So there's lots of reasons to get rid of cobalt-60. And so that's an easy first step. The bigger step, I think, is as Iris has laid out. And my dream is to make this $1 million machine. That's my goal, make $1 million machine.
Okay, I think there's another one. I'm just not sure whether it's Dr. Fatiga. And do you want she or he raise a hand from audience? Do you want to ask questions?
Because someone asked me about treatment time. We're still fine tuning things, but on average, treatment times are certainly already faster than Gamma knives and cyber knives, depending on the type of case. We still do not have a good solution for multi-mets. So there's too time intensive, but over the course of this year, you'll see a best-in-class solution for multi-mets, and it'll be even better once we go to ARCs. Now, someone just asked about multi-mets. Yep, that needs to be better. And how do we protect IP and business in China? Well, it's always a challenge, but there's, as far as my perspective, there's 1 million patients in China, so we have a duty to be in China. So, how many fractions? Okay. Anybody else? Okay. I think our time's about
Can I
up.
ask a question? Yeah, it's almost time. So can I ask questions for the functional treatment?
Yes.
So how because this is so precise, the treatment, how can you localize with the current X-ray guided, X-ray image guided system?
Well, it's still embodying the principles of stereotactic localization. So you're referencing off the skull, which is what all stereotaxy does. So, whether you're a Gamma knife using a frame anchored to the skull, or whether you're using a cyber knife, which is using skull-based tracking, which is what we do, you're still referencing the skull. Now, is our sub-millimeter targeting accuracy sufficient? Well, we're going to have to find out, aren't we? And so, but I am continuing to expend effort here at the company to try to make tracking even better over time. And if you guys have some ideas, we always like to talk about that. So forever, it's, as far as I'm concerned, until we get down to 50 micron accuracy, which would be what hopefully my great-great-grandchildren accomplish, we've got a lot of work to do. So more accuracy will give us an opportunity to treat more precisely more lesions. But we already believe we're accurate enough to start treating think a disease like addiction.
Great, thank you. So any more questions from audience? Okay, we are right on time. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Adler, and thank you for all the audience to be with us for the entire talk. And don't forget to visit our website, and then we continue to have lots of ongoing good talks coming. And
Someone said, please don't make the talks political. I don't know if this talk was political. I apologize.
no, I don't think
Is
so.
that,
We're
is that
talking
about
about
China or
technology.
something, trying to IP or something, but it's all right. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.